Hello again, everyone. Back after a little bit of a break, this time on a particular point of reconnaissance involving ARP poisoning. Now, there's really only one requirement for this. Realistically, all that's required is that you already have some kind of network access into an internal network or you have a rogue device set up. Now, in a normal network setting, a device, let's say Windows 10 device, will reach out to the gateway and say, hey, give me the page content for google.com. And the gateway will respond with the page of google.com. And the reason that our Windows 10 device or any device knows where this gateway is because of a ARP table. And it'll have something like, the hardware address for 10.0.3.2, our gateway in this case, is some text, right? Some hardware identifier. What we are going to do in our case is we are going to overwrite this ARP table remotely from within the network. So instead of the Windows 10 device going to the gateway with this specific hardware address that it knows to go to already, we're going to rewrite that table and say, hey, our Kali Linux device is actually the gateway. From the Windows 10 device, this is now 10.0.3.2. And likewise, we're going to forward that traffic to the actual gateway to get the page content that the user is expecting. But simultaneously, what we're going to do is we're also going to rewrite the ARP table for our gateway. And we're going to say, hey, gateway, we are actually our Windows 10 device ending in .22. And likewise, we're going to forward that traffic to the actual Windows 10 device for that page content. That way we can intercept this traffic and effectively act as a proxy or a man in the middle in between these two devices and capture all of the network traffic. Now, just like we were in our demonstration, we're going to be using our Kali Linux device hosted at 10.0.3.4, and we are going to check our gateway to make sure that it is still set to 10.0.3.2 using interface eth0. This is important because of how we format our commands. For our TCP dump to capture network traffic, we're going to tell it that we're using the interface of Ethernet 0. We're going to have one level of verbosity. We're going to capture TCP traffic, and we're going to write it to a PCAP file so that we can analyze it later using Wireshark. Likewise, with EtherCap, we're going to tell it to be text only, and do not forge SSL certificates because we don't want any red flags popping up on our user's browser. Likewise, we're going to be using our Ethernet 0 adapter because we know that's the adapter that we're using for our gateway. We're going to tell it that this is a remote ARP poisoning attack, and we're going to point it to our gateway ending in .2 and our Windows device ending in .22. And we can verify that right here. Likewise, if we check out our ARP table on our Windows 10 device right now, we see our gateway is set to 005056. But if we perform our ARP poisoning attack, it is going to rewrite both our gateway and our Windows 10 device. We can already see our TCP dump is capturing some basic network traffic as it calls back. And if we look at our Windows 10 device, we see our gateway is now overwritten with 000C29. And as far as the user is concerned, nothing has really changed. We can still slack off at work and look up pictures of cats. And network traffic is all fine and normal. And the reason that this attack is a little bit more effective than people might imagine is because a lot of internal sites, especially if they're being internally hosted, well, only if they're being internally hosted realistically, typically don't sign their own sites. This means that all of the network traffic for internal sites or internal web traffic for, let's say, internally used tools or internal web pages, things like that, are typically in plain text. This means that if there was a form in here to input a username and password, we could capture it on our Kali Linux device with the TCP dump and analyze it later with Wireshark. Likewise, we can also see every site that this user visits, and we can better get an understanding of who uses the device. If they only look at cat pictures, maybe they're just a normal end user. But if they go to admin portals for, let's say, Palo Alto or Splunk, or maybe an EDR tool, maybe we're looking at a potential super user, and further attacks can be exploited later. And likewise, if we cancel our ARP poisoning, and also cancel our TCP dump, the ARP tables will be rewritten to the correct state, to where if we look at our Windows 10 device now, we can see the ARP table has already been reset to the correct 005056 device again. Now that we've finished our packet capture, and we have our PCAP file right here, we can open it in Wireshark and limit the source host to the device that we're trying to poison, and we can see all of the traffic that our host is attempting to make. Furthermore, we can narrow this down a little bit and insert a frame match in Wireshark, essentially checking any of the packets over here for the case-insensitive word Google in this case. Likewise, you can do this with cats, like we knew the user was searching. Or, more accurately, you can search for, let's say, a password. Of course, nothing's going to show up because we didn't actually input any passwords anywhere, and none of the forms that we went to actually had the word password, but you get the point. Now, specifically because Windows doesn't generate event logs for whenever an ARP poison attack occurs or whenever an ARP table is changed, you have to start looking at network logs. In this case, we're going to be looking specifically at the Zeek index, which we have for our network log ingestion here with Detection Lab. And if we try to cheat a little bit by hard coding into our detection, specifically our Kali Linux device, which remember we have ending in .4, we can see a lot fewer events than we had with our general network traffic. Right? Quite a difference. And the reason for that is because we wouldn't expect a lot of network traffic or network traffic logs or any logs realistically to be generated from a device that technically doesn't exist, or at least one that we're not expecting to exist. Because Kali Linux is acting as a rogue device, we have a significantly fewer amount of events being generated from it. Now, because we're not going to build a detection based on a cheat, we can change this and say, give us all of the network traffic where our response host is not our known gateway. And this still leaves us with quite a few events. Likewise, if we scroll down here and we check for our response host, we can see we have quite a few addresses. We have Google's DNS, we have a few IPv6 addresses in here, even a couple of different IPv4 addresses in here. These are probably generating some of those cat paws that was on the Google page, if I do imagine. But let's change this up a little bit more. Instead of just saying give us all the traffic that is not originating from our gateway, let's narrow it down and say give us insecure network traffic. In other words, something that someone would want to capture, right? Like port 80 traffic over HTTP. Specifically where the response host is not our gateway. And we can refine this even further by saying give us this traffic that is insecure, the host origin is not our gateway, and the response host is something within our network or within our subnet that we are not expecting. And we have 160 times that the ARP poisoning was rerouting traffic. If we look at the response host, we get this unexpected value of another device other than our gateway. Now, this kind of fails as a detection. The reason for it being is because this has to be hard-coded based on your known gateway and for a specific subnet. As a seam tool, Splunk, or realistically any other seam tool, is not going to be effective at capturing ARP poisoning attacks. Because if you use multiple subnets, let's say you use 10.0 for one subnet and 192.168 for another one, you will have to build different detections for every single subnet that you use in your organization. That is just not very efficient. Likewise, a better response would be using a network rogue device inspection tool, an intrusion detection tool, or even, let's say, specifically logs from Palo Alto or using Palo Alto Panorama can probably get you better alerts and better alarms for when ARP poisoning attacks happen. Likewise, I hope you learned something, and thank you for joining me today. Appreciate everybody coming by.